In a world where people disagree, two guys, one podcast. Two guys who disagree about stuff.
I think it needs to be a running thing where that changes every week. I would love it. How are you doing, Trevor?
All right. Hey, doing pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. We've got the judgment of God outside. We've got a hailstorm with a little bit of lightning and thunder. So we went from freezing last week to beautiful weather early in the week, and now we're back to receiving judgment, as I said. How are things over in the great state of Utah?
In Utah, yeah, things are really good today. It's a beautiful day. Can't complain. Yeah. So today we were going to talk about culture, cultural institutions, and the feeling that is prevalent among the right, that the right doesn't control culture, is losing the culture war. The phrase makes me laugh. But.
Yeah. No, I love that we feel like we have to fight over our culture. But I think that one thing that we do agree on is that culture is probably much more important in building up our value system as a society and influencing our politics than any fact or data could ever do.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you there. I think people are influenced by the people around them, by the group to which they feel like they belong. I think that has a huge influence on what people think politically.
Yeah, we thought that this would be an appropriate topic this week in light of things that have happened over in Mickey Mouse world. You know, Gina Carano being fired from Disney and no longer being a part of The Mandalorian, signing with the Daily Wire.
Wow.
Yeah, cancel culture in general. And you made a really good point before we started recording in our pre-production meeting that we'll probably get to later on about why that might be the case, that only people on the right seem to be canceled. But we'll leave that little teaser for all of our listeners, and we'll kind of get into it.
Right.
So where do you see our culture today? And what I know that's obviously a ridiculously broad question, but I guess to kind of narrow it down, what do you think is important in our culture at large? Who do you think creates or contributes to that culture the most? I guess who has the most power or holds the most cards in that regard? And then what is being done, I guess, or what are the most common and prevalent elements in creating that culture?
You know, I think that things are changing. I think still traditional media has some influence. Things like movies, TV, they still have some sway. They can still pull their weight around. But I think more and more we've seen that individuals are creating media as well. You know, YouTube, people are making their own content. So I think it's harder to say now where the influence is coming from. I think it could be too, like we were talking about a little bit before, that culture is fragmenting a bit. We're not all coming back to the same fountain anymore. I think we're sort of maybe a little bit all over the place, going down our own individual YouTube radicalization rabbit holes or whatever.
Yeah.
You know, all the algorithms leading us into these different, wildly different places. I don't know. It's a broad question, but I think it's a good question. What influences our culture? What we've been talking about, as you've been saying, is that there's a feeling, if I'm characterizing this right, that for the conservatives in America, they feel like the culture is the domain of the left. Like, movies, TV, these things are controlled by progressive people. And if you're a conservative, like whatever, Gina Carano, you can't really voice your opinion. It's not okay because it's not, that's not who belongs in that industry, kind of.
Yeah. So this is my theory. I'll write a book about it someday. No, this is something that I've started to pick up on and synthesize, and I finally started putting into words, not terribly recently, but at least reasonably recently, is there are what I call the 5 pillars of culture that are universal, right? There are institutions that maybe are outside of this or that don't fit neatly into one, but I guess or maybe not the pillars, but the 5 elements of our culture are what happens within our home, what happens amongst our peers, but then also education sources, entertainment sources or leisure sources, and then news and information. People on the right, and I do fall into this camp, tend to feel that in all 5 of those elements, the left definitely has a majority of the power and the influence in each of those 5.
Yeah.
When you look at the education system, a majority of the teachers are progressive, and they become more progressive the further on in the education system you go. So
Sure.
primary, say primary is 40-60 conservative. So it's still leaning left, but not too terribly far.
Yeah.
And then once you get into secondary education, it's like 25-75. And then when you get into tertiary education or university level education,
Sure.
you're at like 15-85.
Yeah.
So people on the left are not only influencing what's being taught and how it's being taught on a classroom level, but they also, because they tend to be the more academic side, if you want to call it that, they're also the ones writing the curriculums, right? So
Okay.
that's the feeling as far as education is concerned. When you look at entertainment, you look at Hollywood, you look at the Gina Carano thing, like I'm not convinced that if Gina Carano's politics were left and if she would have made an equally questionable statement, but the
Right.
politics were flipped,
Sure.
I think she'd probably still be with Disney.
I think that's probably true. Like we were talking about. So if I understand this right, I didn't follow the story, but as we were talking about it, she made this tweet. I did read the tweet, making a kind of dumb comparison to the Holocaust based on her. I think herself being canceled. Right. That was kind of like the reaction.
Well,
Or just other conservatives being canceled.
yeah, I think it's probably that. So the Fire Gina
Okay.
Carano Twitter
Yeah.
hashtag was circulating around a number of months ago because she made other posts on
So
social
that
media
was
that a lot of
before
people
this
didn't
tweet
like.
then?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So there
Okay.
were a bunch of things that people didn't like that she had posted on social media, and I'm frankly not as familiar with that. I don't spend a lot of time following people in the entertainment industry, but
Right. Yeah, me neither.
yeah, she had made this post, but everyone kind of knew she was walking on thin ice. And then when this happened, and then the mob came after her again, Disney's
Right.
just, yeah, we're just gonna
Yeah.
axe this.
Yeah. Well, I think that it's like we were talking about before. It's not. It's probably not. It's not a good thing to make Hitler comparisons. I think there's even like some kind of
There's a
name for
term.
this, like there's a term for when you kind of compare things to Hitler, maybe in situations that don't, because the Holocaust is such an extreme event that it's I think it somehow takes away from your point if you try to compare it to this very, very extreme thing. But I think I do agree with you that that's probably not why she was fired. She's probably fired because she's spouting conservative ideas, and in the entertainment industry, it is a more progressive place. They're not really down with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say that's true.
And so I guess in continuing on with the thoughts, so you've got education, you've got entertainment, or at least mainstream of both of those. You get into news and information. A majority of the journalists out there are going to be progressive, whether they're independent journalists or they're part of one of these larger, more mainstream corporations. And then if you
Okay.
look specifically at the mainstream corporations that generate news content, Fox is probably the only one in the mainstream that's conservative. Everyone else is either slightly left, which is where I think most of them are.
Yeah.
And then you have some that go fairly far to the left. I mean, I don't think that anyone who watches at MSNBC or anyone who reports on MSNBC or commentates there would say that, oh no, we're centrist.
Sure. No,
You know?
they're clearly progressive for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, when you get into peers and home, it gets a little trickier, right? But what I would say and what I think is that the ideal home, and obviously not every home is going to be people who are related to one another. You know, maybe you'll have a one-person household, whatever the case may be. But the ideal household for a conservative is a nuclear family. You know, a
Okay.
mom and a dad who are married and have their little kiddos running around. One parent stays home as a primary caretaker of the children while the other goes out and works as the primary breadwinner. You know, if that is the conservative ideal, that is roughly 30%, actually a little less than 30% of American households.
Okay.
It's like 27% or something like that. And the reason why that is important, or why I would cite that as evidence that the left is kind of winning in the home, is that if, for example, I grew up in a nuclear family,
Yeah.
and I get told repeatedly that I'm ignorant of real struggle, or I don't understand real life because of the privilege of being raised in a two-parent home where, you know, my mom stayed home and my dad went to work.
Okay.
You know, and so maybe it's not so much that the left is winning at home or in households,
Yeah.
but it may be the case that if you grow up in a conservative household, I mean, if you look, I could probably say this, because if you look at what happened on The Bachelor recently, I don't know if you followed that fiasco at all.
No, I don't.
But I'm one of the lucky men in this country that has a wife who likes that show, and so I get
Lots
to
of
watch
people
it
do,
on
yeah.
I get to watch it on occasion, and actually there are times when I enjoy it greatly. You know, I'm not too proud to admit that, but
Wow.
Matt James was the first black bachelor,
Okay.
and I guess the girl that he ended up picking, or ultimately picking at the end, so the one who's going to win and get engaged to him, I guess that she had gone to some plantation party or something like this, some antebellum party on a
Okay,
plantation, and she
Yeah.
got a bunch of flack for that. But her parents, I guess they dug up her parents' voting records, and they're registered
Yeah.
Republicans. And
Okay.
like their social media posts were pro-Trump. And so
Alright.
like Matt James came out and said, "Hey, you know, let's give everybody grace. Let's do these things." Then Chris Harrison basically comes out and say, "Hey, let's maybe let her explain herself before we crucify this girl."
Yeah.
Chris Harrison gets forced to step away from the show, and Matt James then comes out and denounces and throws everybody under the bus, right? Where was I going with this? There was a point to this story. We were talking about the home. So, like, if you come from a conservative household, it has societal impact on how people perceive you.
Yeah.
Because if you so much as come from a conservative household, it's almost like a sin in public society.
Okay.
You know, that you have to cleanse yourself of before you can be accepted by your peers. And so maybe it's not that you're winning directly in the home, but the left definitely controls how we interact with one another, what happens in the workplace, these sorts of things. I feel
Okay.
that the left is definitely winning the war of culture in those areas.
It's been a hard-fought war, but
Yes. We
we
concede.
can finally announce
We concede.
that we have
We'll
won
accept
the
your terms.
culture war.
Let's negotiate the surrender terms. No.
No, I think so. I think that what you're talking about is an interesting jumping off point because it makes me think. It's interesting to me that the right tends to feel that they are losing, or if that's my general impression, that like progressivism is winning somehow in culture. Maybe if not always at the polls, maybe if the government isn't always democratic or whatever, but more generally, TV, movies, just the way people live, the way people act is somehow moving towards that pole. And
Yeah.
is that accurate?
Yeah, that's absolutely accurate.
I think it's interesting because I'm not sure if the counterpart of that exists on the left, in the sense I don't think the left is sitting around talking about how we're winning. Like,
Yeah.
hey guys, did you know that like Disney put out a movie and they threw a nod to some kind of progressive cause or something like that? I mean, maybe a little bit, but I think that among the left, we don't feel like we're winning. I think nobody feels like they're winning. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's probably some truth to that, or
Yeah.
there's merit to it.
But I do think, with what you're saying, I think especially about media, movies, things like that. I think there is some truth to that. I think that perhaps because of the way that those industries are, it just kind of attracts people that are sort of progressive or urban, live in New York and Los Angeles. I think that they sometimes do have a at least left of center slant.
Mm-hmm.
I wouldn't see. You probably won't see some kind of Avengers movie come out with like a right wing nod. Like they
Yeah.
threw in a little thing that's like, hey, gun rights. I just don't see it. Whereas like something like I don't know, anything else, anything left wing, some kind of vague allusion to that, totally happens all the time in these movies.
Well, okay,
Yeah.
so that I think leads to a question that I would have for you. Where do you see examples of the right having cultural power? And then maybe a follow-up to that, and what might flesh it out a little bit, is how do you think that the right uses that power?
Yeah. Well, I think that on the left, the feeling is, and I tend to agree with this, that America is in many ways very conservative, at least in the economic sphere. I wouldn't argue that we're, in general, somehow like socially conservative. Although America is such a big place, I think that there are different states, different areas where the values, the general culture is vastly different. I mean, if you just look right here where I'm sitting recording, I'm in St. George, Utah. I mean, it's changing, but when I was growing up, when me and Michael were growing up here, and still today, very deeply conservative area. I mean, just the general assumption is that you're conservative. If you talk to somebody, they're going to assume that. Sometimes they bring up, right-wing political things, even though, just because like, oh, of course you agree with me, stuff like that.
Yeah.
You might have the opposite in, California or something. But, it's very different. 100 miles away, we got Las Vegas, extremely different.
Yeah.
Just the way things are. It almost couldn't be more different. It's kind of funny. You've got this little sleepy Mormon mountain town, then over here you've got this like gambling neon lights, like, yeah, party. Like, anyway, my point is that America has a lot of diverse cultural things like that. But I think that, especially in the economic sphere, I think that generally we have a conservative bent. I think we have a, or you might call it market liberal, neoliberal bent to things. Unions are extremely weak in the U.S. these days. The laws, tax laws, things like that, tend to favor corporations. This is not Denmark. It's not.
Sure.
We're not like, we don't have like paternity leave, maternity leave, health care, college education, all these things that you see in frankly most developed countries are to the left of us economically. They might not be to the left of us socially. I would say that, but they are definitely to the left of us economically. I can't. There probably are exceptions because I don't know everything, but I can't think of any.
So would you?
Okay, sorry. Excuse me. I rambled a bit. You asked, where does the right have power? How do they use the power? I didn't answer that question. I guess I should say I think that in the economic sphere, the right has power. I think in general, we were talking about Amazon. Amazon, maybe Jeff Bezos owns the Washington Post. Maybe he doesn't like Trump, but I mean, as far as how the factories are run, it's not some kind of
It's not some communist fever dream where
exactly
where the workers have, common ownership of the company with Jeff.
It is not a anarcho-syndicalist collective. Yeah. Anyway, so that's what I would say. I'd say that maybe in Hollywood music that the left has more power. Maybe in business the right has more power. Okay. Yeah. So then my question would be, if there is a feeling we've talked about that progressivism is dominating, is somehow the dominant culture, is at least center left. Do people have a reason why they think that is so? Like, why? Why aren't there? Why isn't there a conservative Hollywood or something? Maybe there is. I don't know.
Well, the Daily Wire is starting to do movies now, so maybe there will be a conservative Hollywood. No.
Yeah.
I think that it's kind of a complex question. So one part of that is, I mean, if you look at a monarchy, you look at a power structure where you have a limited amount of ownership that is possible. All of that ownership has already pretty much been gobbled up. Maybe it'll change hands a little bit, but like the power that can exist already exists.
Yeah.
And so it's a matter of either people gaining that power or taking that power, or the people who have the power giving it up.
Yeah.
There's some sort of combination there. So I feel like cultural power is really important. If we feel like we have power and influence and we could potentially help steer people in the direction that we feel is right, why would we give it up? Right? Yeah. And so my thought is, if there is just a certain amount of power that can exist, because people on the left got there first or snatched it up first, and because they're not inclined to give it up for the reasons mentioned, it's impossible for the right to take back control unless we all of a sudden have some sort of conservative uprising in the United States, or some like great awakening of conservatism, which I don't know, maybe that'd be nice, but I find it unlikely. The other part of that is, I actually think you brought it up and you spoke or said it beautifully. In talking about the fragmenting cultures.
Yeah, I think it is possible that just because the way media has changed, because of the way that we are producing our own entertainment, it's become decentralized. I think that there's a sense in which we have become fragmented. You can kind of dive into your own very niche subculture and live there, and never go outside of that bubble. I mean, we've talked about, me and Michael have talked about things like, this effect where you Google things and then that sort of leads you down where you were already, the path that you were already thinking of. If I Google Earth is flat, I'm going to find a bunch of articles that confirm that the Earth is flat, and thereby, have this sort of confirmation bias. Yeah. And as far as we were talking about media power, I think that it's probably accurate to say that the centers of economic and cultural power in America are places like New York, Los Angeles, and these are places that I'm not going to say that the dominant culture is left wing, is like socialist or something, but I think center left, liberal, socially progressive, maybe. I think that's just sort of the values of those areas, of those urban areas. And then I think that it is true. I don't think it's I don't think it's a hallucination that conservative areas, rural places, are left out of progress, economic progress. They're left out of culture. They're, flyover states. I don't think that that's, a paranoid delusion or something. I think that's true. So yeah.
Okay. And so for this next question, let me give a little bit of a preface.
Yeah.
So people, I've noticed that people on the right tend to be highly critical of public education.
Yeah.
I find that they are highly critical of Hollywood. They're critical of the media, fake news, right?
Right.
That's something that's perpetuated more by the right than it is on the left. And so
Sure.
my thought is people dislike the institutions that exist where they feel they're left out, or that their ideals and their ideas are not represented, right? You get that with race relations in America. You get that with these things. I was just wondering if there's an area where you feel an area of our society where people of the left culturally are highly critical of things that are more progressive outside of economics, because I think that one's pretty.
Yeah.
That one's at least apparent to me.
Okay, so you're saying that conservatives, a lot of times they're critical of Hollywood, critical of the news media, popular culture, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And you're asking, is there some kind of
Equivalent on the other side?
equivalent aspect of culture where the left is always critical? I don't know. I think the essential premise that these big cultural megaphones are coming from democratic leaning areas is accurate. So I don't think that. I think that. I think there's one distinction I might make, which is that there's the left and then there's the left. There's people that are Democrats, Joe Biden or something. I think it's really funny when people say that Joe Biden is like a communist. Just like he is as far left as left goes. It makes me laugh because I feel like that's obviously not true. Okay, there's center left liberalism. There's various shades of social democracy, democratic socialism. There's ultra left wing Marxist Leninist, whatever. But the spectrum goes far down, and I think as far as further on the left towards like the hardline socialist left, they're critical of everything. Hollywood, music, stuff like. They're also critical of it, but sort of from the other direction. It's not progressive enough. I think that there's some truth to some of the things that have been said by left-wing critics like Slavoj Žižek talking about Hollywood movies, talking about how they have this sort of bias towards the status quo in many ways. When you're talking, if you're coming from a point of view of conservatism, then I think that you're going to see the movies as being liberal. But I think if you're coming from the perspective of being on, further on the left, you see the movies as being conservative. It's your relative perspective.
Sure.
Yeah. So I would say that I think the left is okay. You know what? I would be so bold as to claim that among the very progressive left, they're also very critical of Hollywood. Those same institutions, not different institutions, the same ones for different reasons.
Okay.
Even people like, even towards people that the right would consider super lefty, whatever, George Clooney, Brad Pitt, like these people are not, everyone is going to be criticized, I think. I had a question, somewhat tangential, but when we were talking about education, I think that's a very interesting topic. Like homeschooling, I think is something that is in my mind very American. Very, very much of our country. I don't know. I don't have statistics, but I don't know how frequent that happens in other places. And so I know that there's a lot of conservatives that feel that the public school system is going to, teach kids some kind of values that are to the left, where, where they're at, where the family's at. Universities, for sure, have a left-wing slant. Yeah, that's not even. I don't think that's even debatable. Yeah, I mean, unless it's some kind of like ultra-conservative, like John Adams State University or something. I don't know. But I think that's true. Do you think that? I guess the question would be. I feel that there's a sort of I hesitate to phrase this because I don't want to say. I'm not trying to accuse the conservatives of being dumb, but I'm saying that maybe there's some sort of anti-academic sentiment, or towards people that are have PhDs, have degrees, are experts in some kind of field. I get a general feeling from the American right that's sort of like, hey, my opinion on this is as good as yours. What are you telling me with this fancy degree? That's a gross oversimplification, so forgive me. But
I think that there's merit to the question. But I would make a slight distinction between the hard sciences and the social sciences.
Yeah. Okay.
In this way. So in the social sciences, less rigorous means of experimentation, of data analysis, all of that. Sure. More so than in the hard sciences. Yet there are far more papers that are published in journals from the social sciences, right?
Okay.
And there are papers that are published that have 0 citations. Like a very high percentage of papers never get cited by another academic.
All right.
So I would make the distinction there, because just because you have a PhD in I don't even want to name one just for fear of offending somebody, right? But if you are in a non-rigorous science or a non-rigorous discipline of any kind, I feel like people on the right don't care if you have a PhD.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
So even if it's a topic that we care about, right? So if we're talking about, now I am going to get a little bit specific. I feel like I have to, though, in order for this to be anything other than.
I have a degree in international studies, so roast me. Let's say one had a PhD in international relations or English, something like that. Sorry, English majors.
Like, I don't care if you have a PhD in this weird topic,
Right.
And also when it comes to the social sciences, or at least the topics where the social sciences would apply, it's not as much about the qualifications of the person as much as it's about the strength and the validity of the idea.
Okay.
Right? So I can go and I can talk to some random Joe Schmo on the street, and if it's an issue that he cares about and he's well thought out and he's detailed, like, it doesn't matter if he has a piece of paper or not. If it's a good idea, it's a good idea. Or if it's a good point, it's a good point.
So maybe there's a feeling with those humanities degrees, things like that, that those are just sort of representative of this culture, like this sort of this liberal, I don't know, like it doesn't.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. So I don't want to call them made up degrees,
right?
But they are degrees that are propagated by this culture that is cultivated by the left, if nothing else, right? And they're also in areas where being an expert versus a non-expert doesn't matter as much. But if you get into the hard sciences, I think that there's still validity to your question, in that there is a bit of a skepticism still of experts. But then I think it comes down to the timing of the skepticism. No, if you look at the pandemic, and you look at the right's response to it, obviously the right is much more resistant to wearing masks and complying with
Yeah.
lockdown, stay-at-home orders, etc.
Right.
But at least from my perspective, it wasn't like that initially.
Okay.
So when we were told, hey, 2 weeks to slow the curve, let's all stay home, let's try to slow this down a little bit so we can get a better handle on it. Let's wear masks when we're out around people, let's keep social distancing, all of those things. I feel like most of the people on the right were highly compliant. But it's when people like Dr. Fauci and other experts said, okay, we have to wear masks. Oh, masks aren't as helpful. We need to wear 2 masks. We need to be 6 feet apart. No, actually, we need to be 10 feet apart. No, we have to, like, all of these things. Like, as the guidance started to shift and change and it was always moving, I understand that it's a dynamic problem and it was new, but it created the sense of, you really don't know what you're doing. You might be an expert, but you're still new at this too. So how is your expertise in this greater than, some other
Right.
doctor? The guy who lives down the street from me, he's a doctor too, and he thinks this. Like, why should I
Right.
listen to your opinion or your
Yeah.
feeling on this matter more than that guy?
You know, and I will say, sorry, go ahead. Excuse
No,
me.
I was going to say, so I feel like in the hard sciences there might still be a skepticism, but it does have to do with the timing, or if the experts also are being used as a bludgeon politically.
If it's politicized, yeah.
Yeah.
We had this discussion before about, I think when we were talking about climate change,
Yep.
that maybe it's not that people on the right are skeptical in general of scientific expertise or something, but then when it's a political issue, sometimes that creates a skepticism because it's like, oh, okay, now this is political, so I'm not willing to, yeah. I was going to say that I think that the skepticism of expertise is an American cultural thing in general as well. Maybe
Yeah.
it's more prevalent on the right, but I do think it exists on the left as well. You got these people that buy healing crystals and are like, whatever, I'm not gonna use the microwave, something like, like there's also a skepticism, and I think this is anecdotal just from my experience of living in other places, but I feel like in other countries maybe there is sometimes skepticism, but I think that there's places where authority is viewed more as authority. Like when I was in Germany, I just had the feeling that if if the government or the professors says this is true, people can be like, oh yeah, it's true. I don't know, they're the expert. And
Yeah.
maybe there's something cool about how America challenges everything, but I don't know.
Well, I think a good example that highlights your point is medical compliance. So there are a lot of medical complications that arise from the practice of medicine, especially surgery. When a doctor tells you, hey, take it easy for a few days,
Yeah.
don't move, what is the American going to say? He's like, you can't tell me what to do. This is America. I'm gonna get up and do what I have to do. And so medical compliance in the United States is awful. I have a lot of clients, actually almost all of my clients are doctors at work.
Okay.
And I mean, I sell medical buildings, so they're pretty much all doctors, and there are some doctors that have practiced in multiple countries. And one in particular was like, yeah, if I tell a diabetes patient here, or if I told a diabetes patient back in the UK, all right, these are the foods that you avoid, don't eat them, this is when you take your insulin, do it then, this is how much you take. Like, there may have been some issues, but it wasn't really an issue that you had to follow up on over and over and over and over and over again and really stay on your patients. But he said, if I give that same direction to anyone in the United States, only 20% of the time will they actually do what I say.
Good old USA. Yeah.
Yeah. So there probably is a lot of
that.
truth to that. that
Yeah.
it's a largely American trait, but the skepticism will probably be a little bit bigger on the right.
Yeah.
I could buy that.
I think the sense of who's winning and who's losing and this culture war, I think it's super interesting, and there's probably a million things that we could talk about. A million things that I can't think of right now. I Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I would say all that I would add is the fact that it is branded as a culture war in and of
Yeah,
itself is probably a problem. And
probably.
that is the way that a lot of people feel. If you look
Yeah.
at education, the right's probably or the education system, the right's probably going to be more critical than the left is
Hmm.
because that's an area where they feel like they are disproportionately disadvantaged.
Okay. Yeah.
If you look at race relations, that's obviously a part of our culture, even though it's not an institution of our culture, at least is the way that we've characterized it. And people who are non-white feel the same way.
Yeah.
They feel like they are disproportionately
Disenfranchised.
disadvantaged as a result of their race. And so, in all of these areas, like maybe this is a conversation for another time. It actually probably is, looking at the time. I wonder what the merit is to potentially saying, you know what, we're losing in this way, or we don't have as much influence as maybe somebody else does, but we're okay with that. And we're not going to try to tear somebody down just because they have more power or influence than we do. I wonder what that would do.
I think my if I might offer my final thought, I guess what I would think is that I think my fear. I've never. I guess I could accept that a lot of cultural institutions in America have a sort of center left bent. I mean, I don't think the left feels victorious. I don't think people on the left are like, yeah, we're winning.
No parades.
No parade. No, yeah, exactly. But I think my fear, more than winning or losing, is that we just kind of splinter. I
Yeah.
think just because of the internet, because of these forces, that eventually, you don't. It's not even a conversation. It's not one conversation. It's all these different conversations, all these different factions that just don't interact. And I think that is my concern. That if I could envision the end of the United States, I think that's probably how it would end. And I don't know. Maybe that wouldn't be. It's not the end of the world. Obviously, we're not the world, but.
We could change
I
our
think it
name
would
to the
just be that
Separated States of America.
not United States. I feel like that to me is the most likely end scenario. Is that we eventually decide that we don't work as a country, that there's that the differences become too large, and that we fragment. That's kind of what I'm afraid is happening.
Yeah. Well, let's hope that doesn't happen. Especially not in the next week, because I want to talk to you again next week.
Right. Yeah. Okay. All right, Michael. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, you too, man. Take care.